Welcome to Sleepy Crimes. I am Anna, your host. Tonight, we drift into the shadows of soft bone modification theory and a place that local legends call the Hollow in the Woods. It is late now, and the world outside has grown still. I want you to find a comfortable position. Let your shoulders drop away from your ears. Feel the weight of your blankets pressing gently against you. Imagine, if you will, the scent of damp earth and the distant, rhythmic sigh of wind moving through ancient pines. Our journey begins in the autumn of 1984, in a patch of wilderness that seemed to exist outside of time. It was a place where the air felt heavy, thick with the moisture of 1,000 passing storms, and where the ground beneath your feet felt more like a living, breathing thing than simple soil. In this quiet place, a mystery was unearthed that would challenge everything the local authorities thought they knew about the finality of death. The woods themselves were vast, sprawling across thousands of acres of rugged terrain. Deep within this expanse lay the Hollow, a low-lying depression where the fog seemed to settle and refuse to leave. In 1984, the forest was a tapestry of deep greens, burnt oranges, and the skeletal gray of birch trees. The ground was carpeted in a thick, spongy layer of moss and fallen needles that muffled every footstep. It was a place of profound silence, broken only by the occasional cry of a crow or the rustle of a small animal in the undergrowth. This was not a forest for the casual hiker. It was a dense, confusing labyrinth where the sunlight barely reached the floor, even at high noon. The shadows here were long and persistent, stretching out like dark fingers across the pathless earth. It was in this environment of constant dampness and dim light that the remains lay waiting, hidden just beneath the surface of the peat and silt, slowly changing into something that defied the laws of biology. On a crisp Tuesday in October of 1984, a local man was traversing the edge of the Hollow. He was looking for a lost hound, his boots sinking into the soft, yielding earth. As he moved through a particularly dense thicket of ferns, he noticed a patch of ground that looked disturbed. It wasn't the typical rooting of a wild animal. The soil was a dark, rich black, and it had been piled in a way that suggested human hands. Protruding from the edge of this shallow mound was a pale, curved object. At first, he thought it was a discarded piece of white plastic or perhaps a fallen branch stripped of its bark. But as he knelt closer, the metallic scent of old iron and the cloying sweetness of decay met his senses. He reached out, hesitating, and touched the object. It didn't feel like wood, and it didn't feel like stone. It was strangely yielding, almost like heavy rubber. Fear, cold and sudden, washed over him as he realized he was looking at the distinct curve of a human rib, yet it was unlike any bone he had ever seen. By the time the first responders arrived, the sun was beginning to dip below the horizon, casting the Hollow into a deep, bruised purple. 2 officers, Miller and Henderson, made the long trek into the woods, their heavy flashlights cutting narrow tunnels of light through the gathering mist. They were experienced men, used to the occasional grim discovery in the wilderness, but nothing had prepared them for the atmosphere of this specific site. When they reached the shallow grave, they set up a perimeter, the yellow tape looking garish and unnatural against the deep browns of the forest. They began the delicate process of clearing away the top layer of soil with small hand tools. The earth was saturated, clinging to their gloves in thick, cold clumps. As the shape of the body began to emerge, the confusion in the air became palpable. They found the remains of what appeared to be a young adult, but the skeletal structure looked warped, as if the person had been made of wax and left too close to a flame. Officer Miller reached down to stabilize a section of the femur as they cleared the surrounding silt. He expected the hard, unyielding resistance of human bone, the kind of calcified strength that lasts for centuries. Instead, under the pressure of his fingers, the bone flexed. It didn't snap, and it didn't crumble. It simply bent, bowing outward like a piece of green wood. He pulled his hand back as if burned, his breath hitching in the cold air. His partner, Henderson, leaned in, his flashlight beam shaking slightly. They looked at the skull, which appeared flattened, the eye sockets elongated into strange, weeping ovals. It looked more like a leather mask than a human cranium. This was the birth of the confusion that would haunt the 1984 investigation. There were no signs of traditional trauma, no bullet holes or knife marks, just this impossible softness. The first responders stood in the darkening woods, surrounded by the towering trees, feeling as though they had stepped into a world where the very foundations of the human body had been unmade by the earth itself. The officers spent the next 3 hours in near silence, the only sound being the scrape of their trowels and the distant hum of the wind. Every time they touched the remains, the sensation was the same. A disturbing, fleshy pliability that suggested the bones had lost their mineral essence. They whispered to each other about chemical spills or strange diseases, their minds racing to find a logical explanation for why these remains felt more like ancient parchment than skeletal remains. In the 1984 police report, Henderson would later write that it felt as if the hollow had been trying to digest the body, slowly dissolving the hard parts and leaving only a flexible, ghostly shell behind. This was the first recorded evidence of what would later be debated in hushed tones as soft bone modification theory. As the moon rose over the trees, the investigators prepared to transport the remains, unaware that the strange properties of the hollow were only the beginning of a much deeper, much darker story that would take decades to fully unravel. For now, the woods held their breath, and the mystery lay heavy in the damp, midnight air. The transition from the wild, wind-swept excavation site to the sterile stillness of the city morgue is a shock to the senses. Here, the air is not filled with the scent of damp pine and ancient earth, but with the sharp, biting sting of antiseptic and the low, constant hum of the ventilation system. It is a place of absolute order, where the mysteries of the forest are meant to be solved by the cold precision of the scalpel and the microscope. The remains have been transported in sealed containers, protected from the morning light that was just beginning to touch the horizon when the last of the evidence bags was zipped shut. Now they lie on a long table made of brushed stainless steel, illuminated by rows of long fluorescent tubes that cast a flat, shadowless light over the scene. The medical examiner, a woman who has spent over 20 years cataloging the many ways a life can end, stands at the head of the table. She moves with a practiced, rhythmic grace, her movements slowed by the heavy weight of the task before her. The silence in the room is thick, broken only by the occasional squeak of her rubber-soled shoes against the linoleum floor and the rhythmic click of the recorder as she begins her initial observations. She starts with the external examination of the skeletal structure, noting the peculiar hue of the bones. Usually, remains that have been buried for a long duration take on a brittle, chalky appearance, stained by the minerals of the surrounding soil. These, however, possess a strange, waxy luster. They are the color of darkened honey or deep ochre, looking almost as if they have been polished by hand. The pathologist leans in closer, the magnifying lens catching the light as she scans the surface of the humerus. There are no tool marks, no signs of animal scavenging, and none of the jagged fractures one might expect from a body subjected to the pressures of the earth. Everything is intact, remarkably so. She reaches out with a gloved hand to adjust the position of the radius, expecting the familiar hollow clatter of bone against steel. Instead, there is no sound. There is only a soft, dull thud, a sound more characteristic of a heavy piece of leather or a bag of dense grain than the remains of a human being. She pauses, her brow furrowing behind the clear plastic of her face shield. She adjusts her grip, her fingers closing around the midshaft of the long bone. It feels heavy, far heavier than any skeletal remains she has handled in her 2 decades of service. It carries a weight that seems to pull toward the floor, a density that defies the porous nature of human anatomy. The moment of true discovery happens with a suddenness that makes the heart skip a beat. As the pathologist applies a standard amount of pressure to steady the bone for a measurement, the surface does not resist. It does not snap, and it does not scrape. To her utter disbelief, the bone yields. Under the firm press of her thumb, the hard exterior of the femur begins to indent. It is a slow, steady displacement, like pressing a finger into a block of chilled beeswax or a mound of heavy, wet clay. She pulls her hand back as if burned, her breath hitching in the quiet room. She looks at the bone, then at her own hand, as if questioning the reality of the physical world. The indentation remains. It does not spring back like flesh, nor does it shatter like brittle calcium. It simply stays there, a small, smooth crater in the center of what should be the strongest bone in the human body. She reaches for a small metal probe, her movements now hesitant and filled with a growing sense of dread. She touches the tip of the instrument to the surface of the skull, applying only the slightest bit of weight. The metal sinks in, disappearing 3 millimeters into the parietal bone without a single sound of resistance. There is no cracking of the table of the skull, no splintering of the ivory. It is as if the entire skeleton has been transformed into a substance that is only pretending to be bone. The air in the morgue seems to grow colder as the realization sets in. This is not a natural state of decay, nor is it a known pathology found in any medical textbook. She begins to test other areas of the remains, moving with a frantic, yet clinical intensity. The ribs, which should be thin and prone to snapping, curl under her touch like strips of soft lead. The vertebrae, normally a complex architecture of interlocking bone, feel like a series of rubberized gaskets stacked one on top of the other. She picks up a smaller bone from the hand, a metacarpal, and finds that she can gently bend it between her fingers. It moves with a terrifying pliability, arching into a crescent shape before slowly settling back into its original form. There is a texture to it that she can feel even through the thick layer of her latex gloves, a strange, thrumming vibration that seems to reside within the material itself. It is not a pulse, for there is no heart to drive it, but a subtle structural resonance. She describes the sensation into her recorder, her voice trembling slightly. She calls it a clay-like consistency, but even that does not quite capture the wrongness of it. It is as if the very molecular bond of the skeleton has been rewritten, replaced by a modification that allows the frame of a human being to be molded like a sculptor's medium. As the hours of the early morning creep toward dawn, the pathologist finds herself sitting at her desk, staring at the monitors. The initial scans of the bones show a density that is off the charts, yet the structure is entirely missing its crystalline lattice. It is a solid, amorphous mass that has retained the perfect shape of a human skeleton, right down to the microscopic grooves where tendons once attached. She begins to formulate a terrifying hypothesis, one that will later be whispered in forensic circles as the Soft Bone Modification Theory. It suggests a process not of decay, but of intentional chemical alteration. She wonders if someone could have introduced a substance into the body, perhaps while the person was still alive, that slowly traded calcium for something more malleable. The thought of a living person's frame turning to clay from the inside out is enough to make her turn away from the screen. Outside the window, the first gray light of morning is beginning to filter through the city haze, but inside the morgue, the darkness feels more profound than ever. The bones lie on the table, still and silent, holding a secret that defies every law of biology she has ever sworn to uphold. They are no longer just remains. They are a masterpiece of biological engineering, a terrifying testament to a knowledge that should not exist. The medical examiner finally puts down her pen, her hands steady but her mind racing with 1,000 unanswered questions. She looks at the indentation her thumb left on the femur, a small mark that has not faded or changed in over 4 hours. It is a permanent record of a physical impossibility. She knows that the investigation will have to expand, moving beyond the simple search for a cause of death into the dark reaches of experimental chemistry and fringe science. The officers who found these remains had no idea what they were carrying back to civilization. They thought they had found a victim of a simple crime, a forgotten soul left in the woods. But as the pathologist gazes at the waxy, golden glow of the bones under the sterile lights, she realizes that the person on the table was not just killed. They were transformed. The soft bone modification theory is no longer just a flicker of a thought. It is a heavy, undeniable reality resting on a stainless steel table in the heart of the city. The true work is only just beginning, and the path ahead is as pliable and uncertain as the very bones she has been tasked to study. For now, the room remains silent, the only sound the distant hum of the world waking up outside, oblivious to the impossible truth that has been unearthed. The name on the heavy manila folder was Eleanor Vance. It was written in a cramped, hurried cursive that seemed to lean toward the edge of the page, as if the ink itself were trying to escape the confines of the paper. For the investigators, this name was the first solid thing they had touched in weeks. Until now, the victim had been a collection of impossible biological puzzles, a body that defied the very laws of skeletal structure. But now she had a name, a history, and a trail of breadcrumbs that led away from the sterile silence of the morgue and back into the heart of the city. As the lead detective ran his thumb over the embossed letters of her identity, he couldn't help but notice how mundane she seemed on paper. Eleanor was 32 years old. She had no criminal record, no outstanding debts, and most hauntingly, almost no living relatives to claim her. She was a woman who had lived in the periphery of the world, a shadow moving through a life defined by the needs of others. The air in the precinct felt heavy that afternoon, thick with the scent of ozone from the old radiators and the metallic tang of cold coffee. They began to pin her life onto the corkboard, one fragment at a time, looking for the moment when a normal woman began to turn into a medical anomaly. Eleanor's history was a long, quiet stretch of gray years. For 11 years, she had been the primary caretaker for her invalid mother. Think of that duration for a moment. 11 years of lifting, turning, feeding, and cleaning. 11 years of hearing the same labored breaths in the room next door, of watching the sun rise and set through the same cracked windowpane. The investigators found that during this decade of isolation, Eleanor had rarely left their small apartment. She was a woman who had become a master of the interior world, her universe shrinking down to the size of a sick room. Neighbors described her as a ghost, a pale figure who occasionally appeared at the grocery store with a list of soft foods and heavy detergents. She never looked anyone in the eye. She moved with a strange, hesitant grace, as if she were afraid that a sudden movement might cause her to shatter. But as the detectives dug deeper into the financial records left behind after her mother's passing, they found the first missing thread. It wasn't a record of grief or a bill for a funeral. It was a series of checks, written in that same trembling cursive, made out to a clinic that didn't appear on any official medical register. The sums were small at first, then grew larger, draining the modest inheritance her mother had left behind within a matter of months. The clinic was located in a district of the city where the buildings are tall and narrow, leaning against one another like tired old men. The streets there are paved with cobblestones that have smoothed over a century of carriage wheels and rain, and the light never quite seems to reach the pavement, even at noon. Tracing Eleanor's movements, the investigators found that she had begun visiting this location 3 times a week. The appointments were always scheduled for the late evening, just as the city began to settle into its nightly fever. According to the transit logs, she would take the crosstown bus, sitting in the very back, her hands folded neatly over a small leather purse. One witness, a bus driver who worked the night shift for 20 years, remembered her. He described her not by her face, but by the way she sat. He said she seemed to collapse into the plastic seat, as if her spine were made of silk rather than bone. He recalled how she would stare out the window at the passing neon signs, her reflection looking back at her with hollow, expectant eyes. She was traveling toward something, he said. Not away from her life, but toward a version of herself that she hadn't yet met. The investigators began to realize that the soft bone modification theory wasn't just a result of a strange illness. It was a process, a deliberate, systematic reshaping of a human being. In the basement of the records department, under the hum of fluorescent lights that flickered with a rhythmic, hypnotic buzz, they found the medical files. These weren't standard charts. They were filled with hand-drawn diagrams of the human skeletal system, but the proportions were all wrong. The ribs were elongated, curving back on themselves in elegant, terrifying spirals. The joints were marked with strange symbols, notations that suggested a flexibility that should have been fatal. The documents spoke of a treatment meant to release the body from its rigid cage. They referred to the skeleton as a temporary scaffolding, something to be outgrown once the spirit was ready. The scent of the archive was overwhelming, the smell of decaying pulp, ancient glue, and a faint, sweet undertone of formaldehyde. As the detectives turned the pages, the paper felt unusually heavy, almost damp to the touch. They found Aliner's specific file tucked between two others. Inside, there were no photographs of her face, only X-rays. In the first few, her bones appeared normal, if a bit thin from years of malnutrition. But as the dates progressed, the images changed. The sharp, white lines of her calcium-rich structure began to blur. They became translucent, ghostly, as if the bone were turning into jelly. By the final image, taken just 2 weeks before her disappearance, her ribcage looked like a delicate, woven basket, pliable and soft. The investigators sat in the silence of the archive, the weight of the discovery pressing down on them. This was the first missing thread, the realization that Aliner Vance had sought this out. She hadn't been a victim of a random accident or a rare disease. She had been a patient. But who was the doctor? The name on the letterhead was simply the Institute for Structural Harmony. There was no address listed, only a post office box that had been closed for 5 years. They searched for a staff list, but found only a single signature at the bottom of the treatment logs. A sweeping, arrogant flourish that looked like the letter M. They began to map out the appointments, tracing a path through the city's labyrinthine subway tunnels and forgotten alleyways. Each appointment was a step closer to the edge of the known world. Aliner had been shedding her physical self, layer by layer, bone by bone. The detectives realized that if they wanted to find where Aliner had gone, they had to understand what she was trying to become. The city around them suddenly felt different. The stone walls of the buildings, the iron railings of the stairs, everything seemed too hard, too permanent. They began to imagine the world through Aliner's eyes, a world where the only way to survive was to become as soft and yielding as the shadows that lived in the corners of her mother's room. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, bruised shadows across the precinct floor, the detectives prepared for their next move. They had identified the location of the final appointment Aliner had attended before she vanished. It was an old brownstone on the edge of the warehouse district, a place where the streetlights were often broken, and the only sound was the distant, rhythmic thumping of the river against the docks. They knew that whatever they found inside those walls would either solve the mystery of the soft bone theory or pull them into the same dark current that had carried Aliner away. The air outside was turning cold, the kind of damp chill that settles into your marrow and refuses to leave. They pulled on their coats, the leather creaking in the quiet room. The first thread was pulled, and the rest of the tapestry was beginning to unravel. Somewhere in the city, the silence was waiting for them, a silence that tasted of copper and old dust. They stepped out into the night, the heavy door clicking shut behind them, leaving the file of Aliner Vance lying open on the desk, her translucent X-rays shimmering faintly in the moonlight like the wings of a moth. The precinct was quiet now, the frantic energy of the afternoon replaced by the rhythmic, steady hum of the ventilation system and the occasional, distant splash of tires on rain-slicked pavement outside. Detective Miller sat hunched over a heavy oak desk, his silhouette cast in a sharp, blue-tinged glow from the single overhead lamp. Before him lay a collection of weathered, cream-colored folders, their edges softened by years of handling. He reached for a translucent sheet of film, an X-ray taken years prior, though its clarity remained unsettling. As he held it up to the light, the image did not show the sharp, white contrast of healthy skeletal structures. Instead, the bones appeared clouded, almost fluid, like smoke trapped within a glass jar. This was the first piece of the puzzle that pointed toward something far more intricate and devastating than a simple injury. It was the physical evidence of a process that defied conventional forensic understanding, a phenomenon known in the darker corners of experimental biology as the soft bone modification theory. To understand the horror of this theory, one must first appreciate the delicate architecture of the human frame. Our bones are not merely dead stones supporting our weight. They are living, breathing monuments of biological engineering. Under a microscope, bone is a masterpiece of balance, composed primarily of two distinct elements. There is the organic matrix, mostly made of a protein called collagen, which provides flexibility and tension. Woven into this soft scaffold are the inorganic minerals, specifically a crystalline form of calcium phosphate known as hydroxyapatite. This mineral gives our skeletons their legendary strength and rigidity, allowing us to walk, run, and stand tall against the pull of gravity. In a healthy body, these two components work in a perpetual dance of reinforcement. But the theory Miller was now investigating suggested a way to break that dance, to systematically dismantle the mineral walls of the body while leaving the organic house standing. The soft bone modification theory posits that, through the careful application of specific chemical agents, the calcium can be leached away, pulled from its collagen cradle like sand being washed out of a stone wall. The detectives found notes detailing the use of chelating agents and mild organic acids, substances that possess a strange, hungry affinity for calcium ions. Imagine a slow, silent erosion occurring beneath the skin. As these chemicals are introduced into the system, they begin to bind with the hydroxyapatite crystals, dissolving the very thing that makes a person solid. The bones do not break. They do not shatter under pressure. Instead, they begin to soften. They become pliable, losing their ability to resist force. In the chilling descriptions found within the suspect's journals, this was referred to as the demineralization phase, a period where the internal architecture is stripped of its hardness, turning the skeleton into something resembling dense, heavy rubber. But it is the methodology of this theory that truly haunts the mind. Most chemical processes involving bone occur after death, when the body is a static vessel. However, the architect of this specific crime believed that for the modification to be successful, the subject had to remain alive. This was not a matter of cruelty for its own sake, but a perceived scientific necessity. The theory suggests that the body's own metabolic processes, the natural turnover of cells, are required to integrate the change. By keeping the subject's heart beating and their blood circulating, the chemicals could be distributed evenly through the bone's vascular network. The living system would attempt to repair the damage as it happened, but because the leaching was constant, the body would effectively rebuild its own bones without the calcium. It would create a new kind of structure, one that was flexible and entirely subject to the will of an outside force. The air in the lab grew colder as Miller read further into the technical requirements. The process required an excruciatingly slow pace, spanning over several weeks or even months. If the calcium was removed too quickly, the sudden shift in blood chemistry would stop the heart. It had to be a gradual transition, a delicate balancing act between dissolution and survival. The notes described the subject as a living sculpture, their limbs able to be bent into impossible angles without the snapping of a single bone. In the dim light of the precinct, the detective looked down at his own hands, the knuckles hard and fixed, and felt a sudden, visceral shiver. The architecture of the bone is supposed to be our ultimate defense, the final boundary between our internal selves and the outside world. To have that boundary turned into something soft and moldable was a violation that went beyond the physical. It was a fundamental betrayal of biology. As the clock on the wall ticked toward 2 in the morning, the full scope of the architecture of bone began to reveal its darker side. The theory wasn't just about softening, it was about reshaping. The suspect had noted that once the bones reached a certain level of decalcification, they could be set into new positions using external braces. If the calcium was then allowed to slowly return, a process called remineralization, the bones would harden once more, but in their new, distorted shapes. It was a way to permanently alter the human form at its most basic level. Miller closed the folder, the sound of the paper hitting the desk echoing in the empty room. He realized now that they weren't just looking for a killer. They were looking for someone who viewed the human body as nothing more than raw material to be harvested and rearranged. The shadows in the corner of the room seemed to stretch, twisting into long, curved shapes that mimicked the distorted X-rays on his desk. The night was far from over, and the secrets held within the architecture of bone were only beginning to surface. The industrial district of the city was a graveyard of brick and rusted iron, a place where the air always tasted of cold metal and ancient soot. The detectives arrived at the textile warehouse just as the moon was obscured by a heavy shroud of low-hanging clouds. It was a massive, windowless structure that seemed to absorb the streetlights rather than reflect them. Inside, the silence was thick, broken only by the rhythmic dripping of a leaky pipe somewhere in the vast, vaulted ceiling. Thousands of bolts of fabric were stacked on towering wooden pallets, creating a labyrinth of heavy wool and rough denim. The smell of dust was overwhelming, a dry and suffocating scent that clung to their clothes as they moved deeper into the shadows. They were looking for something that shouldn't exist, a ghost in the blueprints of the old neighborhood. Detective Miller led the way, his flashlight cutting a sharp, white path through the gloom. He stopped near the back of the building, where the floor was reinforced with thick concrete. Behind a massive roll of charcoal-colored felt, he found it. A hidden seam in the floorboards, almost invisible to the naked eye. It took the combined strength of both men to haul the heavy iron hatch upward. The hinges groaned, a long, high-pitched metallic shriek that echoed through the empty warehouse like a warning. Beneath the hatch, a narrow set of stone stairs descended into a darkness that felt different from the shadows above. It was a dense, heavy cold that rose up to meet them, carrying a faint, clinical undertone that didn't belong in a place meant for weaving and tailoring. They began their descent, step by careful step, into the earth. As they reached the bottom, the smell of the warehouse vanished, replaced by the sharp, stinging scent of medical-grade antiseptic and ozone. The transition was jarring. They found themselves in a long corridor lined with white tiles that shimmered under the pale glow of humming fluorescent lights. The walls were scrubbed so clean they seemed to glow with a sickly luminescence. There was no dust here, no signs of the industrial decay that defined the world upstairs. Instead, there was a profound sense of order. At the end of the hallway sat a heavy steel door with a small, reinforced glass window. When Miller peered through it, his breath hitched. This was not a storage room or a cellar. This was a fully realized, state-of-the-art surgical suite, hidden away from the world and the law, designed for a singular, terrifying purpose. The room was dominated by a central operating table made of polished stainless steel, its surface reflecting the overhead surgical lamps like a mirror. Around the perimeter of the room stood glass cabinets filled with rows of jars and stainless steel trays. But it was the machinery that drew their attention. These were not standard medical instruments. There were hydraulic presses modified with delicate, padded clamps and long, slender rods that looked like they were designed to be threaded through something narrow and fragile. The air in the room was kept at a precise 64 degrees, creating a perpetual chill that made their skin crawl. On a side table, they found a collection of what looked like architectural blueprints, but they weren't for buildings. They were intricate, layered diagrams of the human skeletal system, marked with complex mathematical notations in black ink. In the corner of the suite stood a specialized immersion tank filled with a clear, viscous fluid that shimmered with a faint violet hue. A small label on the side of the glass read, Soft Bone Modification Solution, Batch Number 4. This was the physical proof of the theory they had been chasing for months. The equipment was designed to do the impossible, to manipulate the very foundation of the human frame without traditional breakage. They found specialized bracing systems, adjustable to the millimeter, crafted from lightweight polymers and surgical steel. These weren't tools of healing, they were tools of transformation. The realization began to settle in their minds like heavy silt at the bottom of a river. This underground clinic was a factory, and the raw material was the very structure that allows us to stand upright and move through the world. The detectives moved through the space with a reverence born of pure dread. In a small side office, they discovered a filing cabinet containing hundreds of folders. Each one was a case study, complete with x-rays that showed bones that had been lengthened, curved, or flattened in ways that defied natural biological growth. The dates on the files went back over 10 years, suggesting this operation had been thriving in the shadows of the textile industry for a decade. The sheer scale of the organization was breathtaking. As the hum of the ventilation system pulsed through the walls, Miller realized that they were standing in the heart of a nightmare. The soft bone modification theory was no longer a frantic scribbling on a chalkboard. It was a reality of steel, chemical, and bone. They had found the site, but the master architect was nowhere to be seen, leaving only the cold silence of the clinic to keep them company. The drive into the neighboring territory was a journey through a landscape that seemed to have forgotten the sun. 45 miles of rolling hills, draped in a thick, silver mist that clung to the windshield like a damp shroud. The investigators traveled in a silence that was heavy with the knowledge of what lay ahead. The call had come in just after dawn, a discovery in a remote corner of a county 3 units away from where a leaner had been found. It was a rural expanse where the houses were miles apart, and the secrets were buried deep in the earth. As the car tires crunched over the gravel of a long-abandoned driveway, the air felt colder, sharper. The destination was a weathered silo, standing like a rusted sentinel against the gray sky. There was no movement here, no sound of birds, only the low, constant moan of the wind. Inside the silo, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of ancient grain and damp earth. A thin layer of pale, fine powder covered every surface, disturbed only by the footprints of the first responders. It was a pattern in the dust, a visual record of a presence that should not have been there. The light filtered through the high, narrow vents in dusty columns, illuminating the centerpiece of this horrific scene. In the center of the circular floor, a shallow depression had been carved out. The detectives moved with a slow, rhythmic caution, their boots making soft, muffled thuds against the ground. They knew what they were looking for, but the reality of seeing it again was a physical blow to the chest. This was not a random act of violence. It was a continuation of a dark, experimental process that defied every law of nature. The remains were laid out with a precision that was almost surgical, yet deeply unsettling. As the lead investigator knelt by the edge of the pit, he felt the familiar prickle of dread along his spine. The bones were visible through a thin veil of translucent soil. He reached out with a gloved hand, gently brushing away the silt to reveal a humerus that looked fundamentally wrong. It possessed a strange, undulating quality, as if it had been softened and reshaped by a master craftsman. This was the core of the soft bone modification theory. It was not just a change in the bone's health. It was a total restructuring of its molecular density. The limb curved in a way that would have been impossible in life, a graceful, sickening arc that spoke of hours of chemical treatment and agonizingly slow physical manipulation. The connection to the first case was immediate and undeniable. This second victim, found so far from the original site, shared the exact same anatomical markers. The detectives thought back to the filing cabinets they had searched just days before, filled with those meticulous, handwritten logs. The notes had spoken of trials, of failures, and of the need for further adjustment. Standing in the shadows of the silo, the systematic nature of the crimes became terrifyingly clear. This was a series. It was a laboratory that spanned across county lines, a wide-reaching experiment where human beings were nothing more than data points in a twisted study of pliability and form. Every detail, from the specific chemical residue to the way the joints had been fused, mirrored the work found in the final resting place of Alina. The detectives worked through the afternoon, their movements becoming a slow-motion dance of documentation. They used soft brushes to clear the dust, revealing more of the skeleton. Each bone told the same story of intervention. The ribs were tucked inward, overlapping like the scales of a fish, a modification that would have crushed the lungs if it had occurred while the heart was still beating. The stillness of the silo was hypnotic, broken only by the scratching of pens and the occasional click of a camera shutter. The texture of the site was a study in contrasts, the rough, corrugated metal of the walls and the unnaturally smooth, wax-like surface of the modified remains. It was as if the killer was trying to erase the rigidity of the human frame, replacing it with something more fluid and more monstrous. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, casting long, skeletal shadows across the floor, the weight of the discovery settled over the team. This was the proof they had feared. Alina was not an isolated tragedy. She was a chapter in a much larger, more coherent volume of horror. The pattern in the dust led them out of the silo and into a future where they knew more bodies would eventually be found. The experiment was ongoing, and the architect was still out there, searching for the next subject to refine their theory. They packed their equipment in a somber, respectful silence, leaving the silo to the encroaching dark. The case had expanded, the map was growing, and the shadows were getting longer. The systematic, experimental series of crimes was no longer a theory. It was a grim, undeniable reality that they were now forced to inhabit. The rain outside the safe house does not just fall. It hammers against the glass with a rhythmic, percussive intensity that seems to vibrate through the floorboards. Across from me sits a woman whose name, for her protection, we have changed to Alina. She is the one the local rumors call the witness in the rain, not because of the storm tonight, but because of the night she stepped out of the clinic and into a torrential downpour that ultimately saved her life. As she reaches for a porcelain cup of tea, her hand moves with a fluidity that is deeply unsettling. There is no snap to her joints, no rigidity in her wrist. It is as if her skeleton has forgotten the very concept of resistance. She begins to speak, her voice a thin, reedy whisper that barely rises above the sound of the water cascading from the gutters. She tells me that before the procedure ever truly began, they had to prepare her mind. It was a process of systematic unlearning, a way to convince her brain that the architecture of her body was a cage that needed to be dismantled. For 48 days, she was kept in a room where the light never changed, a soft, amber glow that felt like being submerged in honey. The psychological conditioning was the first stage of the soft bone modification. Alina describes how the doctors, dressed in soft gray linens rather than white coats, would speak to her for hours about the burden of structure. They told her that the human skeleton was an evolutionary mistake, an archaic scaffold that limited the true potential of the spirit. They used low-frequency tones that played through speakers hidden in the ceiling, a hum that she says she can still feel in the base of her skull whenever it rains. These frequencies were designed to induce a state of profound physical relaxation, bordering on total paralysis. She remembers being told to visualize her bones turning into wax, melting under the heat of a gentle sun. It sounds like a meditative exercise, but the intent was far more clinical. They were breaking down her proprioception, her brain's ability to understand where her limbs ended and the world began. By the end of the first month, she could no longer feel the difference between the chair she sat in and her own spine. Then came the physical preparations, which were far less gentle. Alina recounts the dietary regimen with a shudder that ripples through her entire frame. Every meal was a liquid slurry, flavored with a metallic aftertaste that she eventually realized was a cocktail of calcium chelating agents. These chemicals were designed to leach the minerals from her skeletal structure, slowly softening the hard deposits that gave her body its strength. She describes the sensation of her teeth beginning to feel loose in her gums, of her ribs bending slightly when she drew a deep breath. It was a slow, agonizing softening that happened over the course of 3 months. She was forced to spend 12 hours a day in a pressurized tank filled with a dense, saline solution. The salt was so concentrated that she floated effortlessly, but the pressure was calibrated to keep her body in a state of constant, gentle compression. It was as if the clinic was trying to squeeze the very essence of her humanity into a new, more malleable shape. The smell of the clinic is what haunts her most. It was a cloying mix of ozone, sterile lavender, and something else, something primal and wet. She calls it the scent of the nursery, though there were no children there. It was the scent of creation. She tells me of the nights she spent listening to the others through the thin walls of her enclosure. She heard the soft, wet thuds of people moving without the benefit of firm joints. She heard the sound of footsteps that didn't click on the linoleum, but rather slapped against it like heavy fabric. This was the result of the soft bone modification theory in its advanced stages. The doctors were not just doctors. They were sculptors of living clay. Alina was being prepared for the final phase, the structural realignment. They told her that her bones were now like young willow branches, ready to be bent into the beautiful, impossible shapes that the theory dictated. They spoke of a life without the pain of gravity, a life where the body could flow through the world like water. On the night of her escape, the clinic was humming with a different energy. There was a power surge during a massive storm, the same storm that earned her her name. The electronic locks on her pressurized chamber hissed open, and for the first time in 90 days, Alina felt the full weight of her own body. It was terrifying. Without the minerals in her bones, her legs felt like they were made of heavy gelatin. She had to crawl through the corridors, dragging her limp, heavy limbs behind her. The floor was cold and wet, and the air smelled of ozone from the failing generators. She describes seeing one of the other patients in the hallway, a man who had already undergone the final procedure. He didn't look human anymore. He looked like a shadow cast by a flickering light, his limbs elongated and curved in ways that defied biology. He didn't stop her. He couldn't. He simply watched her with wide, unblinking eyes as she pulled herself toward the emergency exit. She pushed through the heavy steel doors and fell into the mud. The rain was freezing, a sharp contrast to the warm, chemical baths of the clinic. The cold water seemed to shock her system, and for a moment, she thought she would die right there in the dirt. But the rain did something else. It washed away the metallic taste, the smell of lavender, and the sound of the low-frequency hum. She dragged herself into the woods, the mud caking onto her skin, providing a strange, temporary support for her softening frame. She hid under a fallen log for 2 days, listening to the search parties pass by. They were looking for something structured, something that moved like a human. They didn't think to look for a woman who had become part of the earth itself. Eventually, she was found by a passing motorist, nearly 3 miles away from the clinic site. By then, the clinic was gone. When the authorities arrived, there was nothing left but an empty shell of a building and the lingering, sweet scent of ozone. Today, Alina lives in the shadows. Her recovery has been partial at best. Doctors have used experimental treatments to restore some of the density to her bones, but she will never be rigid again. She moves with a slow, deliberate grace that suggests she is always walking underwater. As the interview concludes, she looks out the window at the rain, her eyes reflecting the gray sky. She tells me that she can still hear the humming sometimes, especially when the barometric pressure drops. It is a reminder of the theory that almost consumed her, the idea that we are better off without our edges. She warns that the clinic did not disappear. It simply moved, searching for new clay to mold. As the tea in her cup grows cold, she says that the most frightening thing wasn't the pain or the chemicals. It was the moment she started to believe them. It was the moment she stopped wanting to stand up and started wanting to flow. The rain continues to pour, a relentless gray curtain that hides the secrets of the soft bone modification from the rest of the world. While Alina struggled to find a sense of normalcy in her fragile body, the investigation moved from the bedside to the sterile, blue-tinted silence of the forensic toxicology laboratory. The challenge facing the team was unprecedented. Normally, bone is the most enduring witness of a crime, lasting centuries as a rigid record of life and death. But the specimens taken from the victims of this shadow theory were different. They were pliable, yielding to the touch like wet leather or dense rubber. Dr. Eris Thorne, a lead toxicologist with over 25 years of experience, described the sensation as something profoundly unnatural. It was as if the very architecture of the human frame had been unmade from within. To understand how this was possible, the team began a microscopic autopsy of the bone matrix itself, looking for the phantom that had stolen the calcium and replaced it with nothing but a haunting softness. The laboratory was a cathedral of high-technology hums and the sharp, clinical scent of ozone. Night after night, the mass spectrometers whirred, breaking down samples into their most basic elemental components. They were searching for a chemical signature, a footprint left in the wake of the modification. After 14 days of continuous testing, they found it. Tucked within the collagen fibers of the bone was a synthetic compound that should not have existed in a biological system. It was a high-purity variant of a chelating agent, a substance designed to bind to metal ions and pull them from their surroundings. This specific iteration, however, was far more aggressive than anything used in standard medicine. It didn't just target excess lead or iron in the blood. It had been engineered to aggressively seek out and dissolve the hydroxyapatite crystals that give our skeletons their strength. The compound was identified as a specialized isotope of ethylnediamine tetraacetic acid, but one treated with a specific molecular stabilizer that allowed it to bypass the liver's natural filtration. This stabilizer was the key. It acted as a cloak, allowing the chemical to travel through the bloodstream unnoticed until it reached the deep, porous layers of the long bones. Forensic analysts spent hundreds of hours cross-referencing this molecular structure against international chemical databases. For a long time, the screens remained blank, returning 0 matches across 64 different jurisdictions. It was as if the chemical had been born from a void. But finally, a hit emerged from a deep storage archive in a small city in the Northern Territories, leading them to a name that had been forgotten by the modern industry: Marotech Synthetics. Marotech had been a boutique pharmaceutical supplier that specialized in experimental treatments for rare bone cancers during the late 1980s. They had developed this specific compound, dubbed Osteo-S9, with the hope of temporarily softening bone to allow for the easier surgical removal of deep-seated tumors. However, the project was shuttered in 1994 after 3 clinical trials resulted in catastrophic systemic collapse for the test subjects. The company went bankrupt shortly thereafter, and their entire inventory was ordered to be incinerated. The paper trail should have ended there, amidst the ash of a failed dream. But when the investigators dug into the final liquidation records, they discovered a discrepancy in the disposal manifest. 500 liters of the stabilized Osteo S9 were missing, listed neither as destroyed nor as transferred to a certified waste facility. The investigation then pivoted to a dusty warehouse in the outskirts of an old industrial district, where the final assets of Marotech had been sold off to pay back creditors. In a stack of yellowed, handwritten invoices from 28 years ago, they found the name of a single rogue buyer. This individual had not purchased the chemical through a medical supply company or a hospital. Instead, they had used a shell corporation called the Altus Group to buy the entire remaining stock of Osteo S9 for a mere few $100s. The buyer had claimed they were using the solution for industrial metal cleaning, a common enough lie that allowed the transaction to bypass the stricter oversight of the health ministry. The signature on the bottom of the invoice was elegant, precise, and chillingly legible, belonging to a man who had once been a prominent figure in the very field of study meant to protect the human body. As the toxicologists mapped the buyer's history, a pattern of obsession began to emerge. This was not a random purchase by a curious amateur. The rogue buyer was a disgraced researcher who had once theorized that the human body was too rigid, too prone to breakage, and that a more fluid, adaptable skeleton was the next stage of human evolution. He had spent decades in isolation, likely perfecting the delivery system that would eventually find its way into Alina and the others. The chemical signature was no longer just a trace of a substance. It was a roadmap back to a person who believed that the destruction of a person's physical foundation was an act of creation. With the name of the rogue buyer finally in their hands, the authorities realized that the soft bone modification theory was no longer a theory at all. It was a lived reality for the victims, and a dark legacy for the man who had bought the world's last supply of the softening agent. The detectives began to trace the movement of those 500 liters across the decades. They looked for hidden laboratories, basement workshops, and forgotten storage units, where the chemical might have been kept stable at the precise temperature required to prevent its degradation. Every lead pointed toward a remote property in the high hills, a place where the air was thin and the neighbors were few. The hunt for the rogue buyer was intensifying, and the forensic team felt the weight of the clock ticking against them. They knew that if this person was still active, there were likely more victims out there, people whose very bones were slowly being transformed into something they were never meant to be. The chemical fingerprint had told them what was happening and who had started it, but now they had to find where the modification was currently taking place before another foundation crumbled into the shadows. The trail of those 500 liters led the investigators away from the industrial docks and into the quiet, ivy-choked corridors of a forgotten medical archive. Here, the air was thick with the scent of decaying paper and the sharp, metallic tang of iron filing cabinets. As the detectives sifted through the mountains of uncatalogued records, they finally found a name that recurred in the margins of the shipping manifests: Dr. Alistair Vance. To the public, he had once been a luminary in the field of osteopathy, a man whose hands were said to possess a divine understanding of the human frame. But in these hidden files, a different story began to emerge, one written in frantic, cramped handwriting. The detectives found a leather-bound journal titled The Sculptor's Profile, its cover stained with a substance that had long since turned a dark, brittle brown. It was here that the transition began, from medicine to a dark, obsessive art form. The office where Vance had spent his final days of legitimate practice was a mausoleum of ambition. Even years later, when the team entered the space, the atmosphere felt heavy, as if the very walls were saturated with his singular focus. There were no family photographs, no personal mementos. Instead, the shelves were lined with hundreds of plaster casts, not of statues, but of human joints, vertebrae, and ribs. Each one had been meticulously sanded and polished until it gleamed like ivory. The lighting in the room was dim, filtered through heavy velvet curtains that had absorbed the dust of decades. As the investigators moved their flashlights across the desk, they saw the deep gouges in the wood, marks left by surgical tools used in moments of intense, nervous energy. It was the workspace of a man who had stopped seeing people as patients and had begun seeing them as raw material, waiting to be refined into something more than human. Dr. Vance had been stripped of his medical license in 1984 after a series of unauthorized procedures that the board had described as grotesque. He had argued that the human skeleton was not a finished structure, but a fluid, adaptable medium. He called this his soft bone modification theory. In his mind, through the careful application of the chemicals he had been stockpiling, the calcium density of a living person could be temporarily reduced, rendering the bones as pliable as wet clay or heated wax. He believed that if he could just find the right balance, he could sculpt a person into a state of physical perfection that nature had never intended. The records show he spent 18 months in isolation after his disgrace, disappearing into a basement workshop where he began his illegal experimentation. He was no longer a surgeon. He had become the sculptor, and he was looking for a canvas that could survive his vision. The sketches found within his journal were perhaps the most disturbing evidence of his descent. They were not clinical diagrams, but haunting, charcoal renderings of bodies with elongated limbs and impossibly curved spines. In the margins, Vance had written thousands of words detailing the exact chemical ratios needed to soften the femur or the radius without causing a total systemic collapse. He spoke of the beauty of a heightened ribcage and the elegance of a neck lengthened by 3 inches. The detectives realized that the 500 liters of specialized solution were not just for preservation. They were the primary tool for his transformative process. He had been looking for individuals with specific skeletal structures, people whose profiles matched the archetypes he had drawn in his madness. He was searching for his masterpiece, and the investigators found a list of 12 names, each marked with a single, chilling word: candidate. Inside the secret laboratory, located beneath an old pottery studio on the outskirts of the city, the investigators found the physical reality of Vance's theory. The room was tiled in white, but the grout was stained a dull yellow from the constant use of acidic vapors. There were mechanical braces designed to hold a human form in place for weeks at a time, allowing the reshaped bones to reharden in their new, unnatural positions. The air in this space was cold, unnaturally so, kept at a precise 42 degrees to slow the metabolic processes of his subjects. On a small metal tray, they found a set of precision calipers and a series of heavy, silver-plated hammers. Every object in the room reflected the sculptor's obsession with symmetry. There was a haunting silence in that basement, a silence that seemed to hold the echoes of the slow, rhythmic sound of bone being pressured into new shapes over hundreds of hours of agonizing patience. The detectives stood in the center of the laboratory, their breath misting in the frigid air. They looked at the empty braces and the jars of chemical solutions, realizing that the sculptor's profile was not just a plan for the future, but a record of what had already occurred. The 500 liters were gone, used up in the pursuit of a perfection that defied the laws of biology. They found a final entry in the journal, dated November 14, 1991. It read, "The clay has finally yielded. The profile is complete." The investigators knew then that they were no longer looking for a madman in hiding. They were looking for the results of his work, the individuals who had been reshaped by his hands and then released back into the world, hidden in plain sight, carrying the structural evidence of a nightmare within their very marrow. The profile was finished, but the hunt for the sculptor's creations had only just begun. The air outside the residence was thick with a damp, clinging fog that seemed to swallow the blue and red flashes of the silent police cruisers. It was exactly 4 o'clock in the morning when the tactical team assembled on the perimeter of the unassuming suburban home. To any passerby, the structure appeared as a monument to normalcy, with its neatly trimmed hedges and a single porch light casting a warm, yellow glow against the brick. But the detectives knew that the normalcy was a mask, a fragile veil covering the architectural manifestation of the surgeon's madness. They moved in absolute silence, their heavy boots crunching softly on the frost-dusted grass as they bypassed the front entrance. The intelligence gathered from the previous laboratory site had led them here, to the primary residence, where the most delicate stages of the soft bone modification theory were believed to be reaching their final, irreversible conclusion. Every man and woman in the unit felt the weight of the ticking clock, knowing that for the final victim, every second lost was a permanent change to their very skeleton. When the breach finally occurred, it was not with a crash, but with the surgical precision of a hydraulic spreader against the reinforced basement door. As the team filtered into the lower level, the scent hit them instantly. It was not the iron-heavy smell of a traditional crime scene, nor the rot of a burial ground. Instead, the air was saturated with the sharp, acidic sting of industrial-grade vinegar and a sickly sweet, milky odor that clung to the back of the throat. This was the smell of demineralization. The walls were lined with rows upon rows of glass carboys, each filled with a translucent, swirling blue liquid that hummed under the glow of ultraviolet strips. The light reflected off the damp concrete floors, creating an underwater atmosphere that felt disconnected from the world above. They moved past workbenches littered with delicate silver instruments, calipers, and hand-drawn anatomical charts that depicted the human frame not as a rigid structure, but as something fluid and malleable, like heated glass waiting to be pulled into a new shape. Deep within the bowels of the basement, beyond a heavy curtain of lead-lined plastic, they found the heart of the operation. A single, low-frequency hum vibrated through the floorboards, emanating from a complex array of life-support machinery that looked more like a sculptor's studio than a medical facility. There, in the center of the room, sat a specialized immersion tank constructed from polished acrylic. The water inside was perfectly still, illuminated from beneath by a soft, amber light. As the lead investigator approached the edge, he saw the final victim. She was suspended in a web of silk-wrapped tension wires, held in a position that defied natural biological limits. Her limbs were not broken, yet they curved with a terrifying, rhythmic grace, as if the bones within had lost their defiance against gravity. This was the pinnacle of the surgeon's theory, the moment where the calcium had been so thoroughly leached from the living frame that the body could be reshaped without the violence of a fracture. The victim's eyes were open, drifting slowly beneath the surface of the oxygenated saline solution. She was kept in a state of profound sedation, a chemical twilight designed to keep her heart beating while her structure was transformed. To the side of the tank, a series of mechanical braces were being slowly adjusted by a computer-controlled motor, inching her spine into an elongated, serpentine curve. The detectives watched in a state of paralyzed horror as a small, silver needle injected a concentrated mineral solution into a secondary port in the tank. This was the beginning of the rehardening phase, the intervention meant to fix the body in its new, distorted geometry forever. The surgeon had not been looking to kill. He was looking to create something entirely different from a human being, a living statue born from the total surrender of the skeletal system. The intricate lace of wires holding her in place looked like a spider's web, delicate and suffocatingly strong, ensuring that not a single millimeter of her form would return to its original state. The tactical medics moved forward with trembling hands to begin the delicate process of extraction. They could not simply pull her out. The soft bone state meant that any sudden movement could cause internal organs to collapse under the weight of her own flesh. They had to maintain the pressure of the fluid while slowly reintroducing stabilizing agents. As they worked, the detectives searched the rest of the residence, finding the surgeon's personal journals neatly stacked on a mahogany desk upstairs. The writings revealed a man obsessed with the idea that the human form was a crude, unfinished draft. He spoke of the soft bone modification as a liberation from the prison of the upright posture. He had monitored his final victim for 62 days, carefully measuring the pH levels of her skin and the density of her femur through the glass of the tank. The maps on his wall showed he had already selected his next 3 subjects, individuals whose bone structures he deemed particularly suitable for his next, more ambitious experiments in structural fluidity. By the time the sun began to rise over the suburban street, the residence had been fully cordoned off. The victim was transported in a specialized, fluid-filled gurney to a secure medical research facility, where a team of 34 specialists waited to begin the years-long process of reconstructive hardening. The surgeon himself was nowhere to be found, having seemingly vanished into the woods behind the property moments before the breach. He left behind a house that was a testament to the dark possibilities of human ingenuity when untethered from empathy. The soft bone modification theory remained a haunting legend in the local precinct, a reminder of the night they found a woman who was becoming something other than human. As the detectives cleared the scene, the smell of vinegar finally began to dissipate, replaced by the cold, clean scent of the morning air. But the images of that amber-lit tank and the sill-crapped wires would remain etched into their minds, a permanent modification of their own perception of safety and the sanctity of the human frame. The courtroom in late November of 2024 was a place of heavy, velvet silence. Outside the tall, arched windows, the last of the amber leaves were surrendered to the pavement, but inside, time seemed to have thickened into a slow, viscous amber of its own. The trial of the century, as some had called it, was reaching its final, breathless chapter. The air was cool, carrying the faint scent of old paper and the polished wax of the mahogany benches. Everyone present moved with a calculated softness, as if a single sharp noise might shatter the fragile truth we were all there to uncover. I remember the way the light hit the dust motes, making them dance in columns of pale gold across the floorboards. It was in this hushed environment that the soft bone modification theory was finally put to the ultimate test. The gallery was packed, yet you could have heard a single pin drop onto the carpeted aisles. We were all waiting for the voice of science to speak for one who could no longer whisper. Dr. Aris Thorne took the witness stand on a Tuesday morning. He didn't look like a revolutionary, but the leather-bound folder he carried contained the map to a new frontier in forensic anthropology. As he began to speak, his voice was like a low cello, resonant and steady. He introduced the jury to the concept of plastic deformation within the human frame, the idea that our bones are not the rigid, unyielding stones we imagine them to be. Especially in the young, or those with certain physiological conditions, the bone is a living, breathing record. He explained that the soft bone modification theory proved that sustained, specific pressure could actually reshape the skeletal structure without ever causing a fracture. This was the silent evidence. The defense had long argued that because there were no broken bones, there was no struggle. But Dr. Thorne showed the high-resolution scans of the victim's ribcage and vertebrae. He pointed to the subtle, microscopic curves, the echoes of a weight that had been held there for far too long. It was as if the body had tried to move out of the way of the pain, molding itself into a new, tragic shape to survive. The room grew colder as we realized that the injuries weren't absent. They were simply written in a language we hadn't known how to read until now. When the verdict was finally read on the 14th of December, the atmosphere felt as though it were under high pressure. The foreperson of the jury stood, her hands trembling slightly as she held the slip of white paper. The defendant sat perfectly still, a statue of indifference in a gray wool suit. When the word guilty was uttered, it didn't come with a bang or a shout. It was a soft, collective exhale from the rows of family members and investigators who had spent 3 long years chasing a ghost. The sentence was life without the possibility of parole. But the victory felt quiet. It felt like a somber acknowledgement of the toll this case had taken on everyone involved. The residence on that suburban street, once a place of hidden shadows, was finally released from its cordons, but the neighborhood would never truly be the same. The echo of silence had been heard, but the cost of that hearing was etched into the hearts of every person who sat through those long, grueling weeks of testimony. The justice served was absolute, yet it carried the weight of a profound and lingering sadness. The impact of this case on forensic science cannot be overstated. Since that winter in 2024, the soft bone modification theory has been integrated into the standard training for medical examiners across the country. It has opened a door for thousands of cold cases where the lack of blunt force trauma had previously led to a dead end. Forensic labs in 32 states have now adopted the high-resolution imaging protocols developed during this investigation. We are learning to see the invisible. We are learning that the human body is a witness that never truly stops talking, even when the breath has left it. This case changed the way we view the very foundation of our physical selves. It taught us that the skeleton is more than a cage. It is a ledger. Every long-held burden, every hidden pressure, leaves a trace. The scientific community now looks at the soft tissues and the pliable edges of the bone with a new, reverent scrutiny. Because of this tragedy, future victims may find their voices much sooner, and the silence that once shielded the guilty is being systematically dismantled by the steady hands of those who study the echoes. As I sit here tonight, reflecting on the journey we have taken together through these shadows, I am struck by the incredible fragility of the human frame. We often think of ourselves as solid, as permanent fixtures in a chaotic world. But we are actually quite delicate, aren't we? We are made of soft curves and intricate joints, designed for movement and grace, yet capable of recording the heaviest of truths. There is a strange beauty in the thought that we are so deeply connected to our own history, that our very bones remember where we have been and what we have endured. It reminds me to be gentle, to hold the world a little more lightly. The case of the echo of silence is a reminder that even when the world seems to have forgotten, the truth remains, waiting for someone with enough patience and enough care to find it. We are all archives of our own lives, written in calcium and spirit. As the story of this trial fades into the annals of history, we carry forward the lesson that no silence is truly absolute. The night is deep now, and the world outside has settled into a peaceful, rhythmic slumber. The details of the courtroom, the microscopic scans, and the heavy oak benches are all receding. We have walked through the darkness and come out into a place of understanding. The work is done, and the questions have found their answers. There is nothing left to solve, nothing left to carry. You can let the tension go from your shoulders now. Feel the weight of your own body against the softness of your bed, a safe and steady presence in the quiet. The legacy of those who fought for the truth lives on, but for you, the journey ends here. The case rests now. Let the details fade. You are safe. Close your eyes, breathe deeply, and have a good night. Sleep well.